in order to look at an overview, I'd like to dig deeper on how people think and where I think the importance of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, is critical. And I'm going to go into this because this affects, I think, how people digest your information. So he developed this concept of two systems. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago for why people make the wrong economic decisions in the middle of the right data. And he's not an econ guy. He's a psychologist. So you can just imagine the Nobel Prize Committee saying, what? We're going to give this to a psychologist? I think what he explains, what he calls System 1 and System 2, is very important from a health literacy point of view. And I recommend that you read his book. It's 500 pages, but if you get it on a Kindle, it just is one screen at a time. I have to tell you, I am a slow reader, and I do have my reading through my ears, through audible.com, which I love. My wife says that's not reading. My response is, you mean the blind can't read? Because they listen to it through there, at which point the conversation usually is over. But I got a Kindle, and I got a Kindle because, among other things, the big, heavy books are just too heavy. I don't like sitting in bed with a heavy book, and it's going down, and they're wonderful. But it's a big book. It took me about 3 months to get through. I read it with other things, junk, trash, all the other stuff that I like to read. Thinking Fast and Slow is the book. Wonderful book. There's also, the big book is the important book. There are a number of other books that explain his theories. If you go to Wikipedia, I'm going to go through them. There are two systems that are working in you right now simultaneously. System 1 is on automatic. And it's where we spend most of our life. System 2 is not on automatic. System 2 is the rational system. System 1 is fast, it's automatic, it's effortless, it's emotive. It's not rational. That should be over on the right-hand side. It's emotive. That's a mistake. That should be on the left. And it's where we spend most of our life. System 2 is rational. It's slow. It takes attention. It takes energy. System 1 uses the rule of thumb. I've done this before. I'm going to do it again. It usually works. It's where we spend most of our lives. It's where you are right now. You're sitting and thinking to me, and then you're wondering, should I check my email or check my cell phone? You're just kind of sitting there kind of wandering. If I say something in the middle of interest, System 2 takes over. System 2 should be monitoring System 1, but System 2 is lazy. It takes energy. And so it's asleep in the wheel, which is why we often make the wrong economic decisions in the middle of the right data. And it's spontaneity. And it's thought of as left brain, right brain, but it's really not. The MRI scans have not shown that it's really there. But it's really, there are major differences between these that have to do with language, and they have to do with how we craft our message. And this is what it is. We have fast and slow. These are other ways that people have taken in looking at a system. We want to go into that. So system on the left, a 1,500 milligram weight is approaching you at your head of that speed. System 1 says, look out. It's automatic. And that's where our patients often are when we're sitting in our office or when you're writing for them. And you want to use both systems. So, motive, you'll die of lung cancer. Rational, you'll live to 100. Expensive, the longer you quit, you'll live longer if you quit. Ruins your clothes, causes COPD. Different ways of actually crafting your message. The best messages are crafted in both systems. The best messages are emotive, where you connect with them in a personal basis in some way, with your story perhaps, maybe with their story, with rational information, System 2 information that will be useful for them. Because when they leave the information on the radio, on the TV, in your office, or what you've written, they're in two systems all the time. System 1 is, gee, I never thought about that. System 2 is, think about what these obstacles are. So, for instance, when I'm in the office and I'm talking to people to quit smoking, and I'll succeed 5% of the time. Excuse me, that's what the data shows. 5% of the time you actually succeed in getting people to quit smoking if I, as a physician, tell them that. And if I say, well, you may die of a heart attack and they're older, they'll say, well, that's okay. I have to die sometime. If I say, you may get a stroke and become disabled and burden your family, they immediately, their eyes light up and they go, I don't want a stroke. I've now activated System 1 in an emotive way. So we struggle, for instance, with statistics all the time. So on the left side, 5,462 motorcyclists were killed in 2009, 33,000 car deaths. On the right-hand side, motorcyclists are about 25 times more likely to die, I didn't finish that up, than passengers in a car. A different way of expressing the same thing. One is with numbers, one is System 1, easy to do. The second thing he talks about is avoiding pain or achieving gain and how that affects us. We are twice as likely to avoid pain and destruction as we are to embrace opportunity. That's very, very important. And it's important from an evolutionary point of view because if we were to be destroyed, we would not stay alive to be able to reproduce, which of course is the Darwinian concept of the struggle in evolution. So when you're looking at embracement of opportunity to patients, you also want to look at the reduction of regret. What have I regretted? And that's very important. In other words, you won't be able to be with your family. You won't be able to see the grandchildren as the reduction of that's something they may regret. That's avoiding pain. So you might be disabled. You might be independent. There are two different ways of looking at things as you look deeper. The next thing is optimism versus risk aversion. Very important within the book. So you have two teenagers there. Come along with me in my super fast car. It'll be fun, exciting, and enjoyable. Many of us did that when we were teenagers. I certainly did. I engaged in activities that now I shudder about and say, how could I do that? Because my frontal lobe wasn't developed? No, it was fun. I didn't think about it. You might get killed. You might get a ticket. You might crash the car. What will mom say? So one is system one. The other really is system two. System two is on the right. That's the rational system. System one is on the left. That's the emotive system. It's much more fun. And as we go through life and struggle through life, we make these decisions. If we're skiing down the hill, I ski down the hill. I make a decision, how fast am I going to go and what sort of a slope am I going to go on? That's system one. That's system two taking over from system one. The next thing is something called sunk lost cost. When you buy into an action, you are more likely to stay with it because of its cost. And you're not likely to necessarily leave it. System one says stay. System two says be rational. Two examples. The first example came from this weekend. We had wonderful friends from Chicago. My friend Nancy is a cookbook editor. I'm a foodie. I've known her for many, many years. And John, her husband, came up, and he's retired. Went into Oregon because we were making homemade Kahlua. I can give you the recipe if you want. Dynamite recipe. Homemade Kahlua. And so we went there, and he said, "Can I go across the street and get a lottery ticket?" I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't buy lottery tickets." He said, "Well, we've been playing the same numbers for years, and we haven't won yet. And we have to keep on playing because if those numbers come up, we're going to be really upset." That's sunk loss analysis. We know statistically the chances that that number is going to come up are the same as any other number on that particular day. But because he's invested, it's not really investment, lost all of the money in that, he's going to continue to do it over and over again. Another good example is you're a CEO of $1 billion company. You bought a $100 million investment, computer software update. 5 years later, that's worth $50 million. It's not worth $100 million. But you've been looking at it, you think it's going to come up, you know that. You leave the company for whatever reason, another reason. Another CEO comes into the company, looks at the balance sheet, sees a non-performing asset for $50 million. What are they likely to do? They're likely to sell it because they haven't bought it. So loss sunk analysis is very important when you're talking to people or doing things. They'll say, "I've tried quitting before, I can't quit. I've tried 5 times, this is going to be the 6th time." It's loss sunk analysis. When in reality, their attempt to quit their health habit is probably about the same the 5th time as it was the 4th time or the 3rd time. But they've sunk time in it, sunk energy in it, they failed before, they feel they're going to fail again. Loss sunk analysis affects the information that you send out. So the other thing is which is more important to the people as we're explaining things, the experiencing self or the remembering self. So when you go to the Grand Canyon, you look at the Grand Canyon, you look in your mind, and you say, how many of you have been to the Grand Canyon, by the way? You remember what it was like. You can bring up the memory. But you often look at the pictures of yourself in the Grand Canyon. Even more than the memory. You may have only been there. The average person is at the Grand Canyon for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And I'm sure the average person looks at the pictures of the Grand Canyon for more than 20 minutes. And so you have the experiencing self and the remembering self when you're actually crafting your message. In other words, what do they remember in their past and what do they have now? Showing them pictures, for instance, of themselves in the past. If they bring in photos and you say, "Would you like to look like that again? Would you like to be that young again?" You can do that if you exercise. Have people bring in older photos of themselves, maybe from 10 years before when they were healthier, and saying, "Let's try to get back to that." That's the remembering self because they're 10 years older. That's not the experiencing self. Again, this is what I think is below and beneath the health literacy messages. And finally, the peak end rule. This is where we judge things when we're listening or talking radio, TV, or a story based on the peak experience or what happens at the end. We talked about Byron yesterday. What he said at the end or what he said at the peak is what we remember because we have something called duration neglect. Now, I want to give a good example, the Traviata. Wonderful, wonderful opera. The opera lasts for about 3.5 hours. We have duration neglect, but there's a very important thing that happens in the opera. What happens is, and I won't go through the story in detail, is that there's a really handsome duke. There's a woman who wasn't good enough for him. They sent the maid away from the family. She suffers. You see it all the way through there. She has tuberculosis. He thinks he doesn't love her. She thinks she doesn't love him. It gets together. She's dying of tuberculosis. The father comes in, and about 5 minutes before the end of the opera, they sing and they yell. They sing to each other, and it's a wonderful, wonderful duet. And then the opera ends. No one remembers, other than the fact that there was a duration of about 2.5 hours, and they were sitting in the opera, and they had to get up and go to the washroom, the duration of the opera, but they remember the wonderful song at the end of the opera, where their heart was just that, and it was the end story. So duration neglect is important and peak end in our experience. In other words, when we're crafting health literacy messages, you have to think about what the peak is within the message and what's the final bottom line at the end. And usually that's what we're looking at when we're listening to a lecture. Well, what's the bottom line? What actually occurs with that? So combining systems between system 1 and system 2, I think actually produces the best product. In other words, you want to give data and information, but you want it to be emotive and fast, and think in those terms when you're actually doing it.